Hi, I'm Radhika, and I'm here to walk you through the process for developing an operating budget for a nonprofit organization. To give some context here, BDO considers financially resilient organizations as those that can stay focused on the long term while continually assessing and responding to current needs. They understand and can tell their financial story. Our perspective on financial resilience consists of these three key elements: values, practices, and resources. The practices of planning, operations, and performance management are the central cycle of a strategic approach to financial management. First, we plan the way that we will use our resources and then monitor the way that those resources are being used to be sure that things are going according to plan, or if we need to course correct. And the operations are the people, technology, and processes that allow us to make and monitor those plans. Today, we're focusing on planning, and more specifically, the annual budget. Before we dive into the five-step budget process, it's important to consider how finance and equity intersect with each other in our organizations. Financial management is not neutral. The processes and decisions involved in financial management dictate the allocation of resources, and the choices we make are steeped in our values. Choices can reinforce structural inequities, or they can challenge those inequities. The items in your budget are an articulation of the organization's values. Similarly, the budget development process is an opportunity to put your values into action by including diverse perspectives and questioning your decisions. We advocate for a transparent, inclusive, thoughtful process. Planning and reflection are essential for making equity a reality for your organization. Budget development can be a daunting task for nonprofit organizations, but it doesn't have to be. We've broken down the process into 5 key steps. The first is to assemble the budget team. Who should be involved? What input do we need? Which perspectives do we need to make sure that we have an inclusive process? The second is to create a budget calendar. Everyone on the team usually has multiple priorities, so creating a timeline and defining milestones and deadlines is critical. Third, we want to prepare for the budget process. Budgeting is a process, and there are some items and tools you need to have ready so you can make informed decisions on your way to budget approval. Fourth is actually building the budget. This step is all about the nitty-gritty details of revenue and expense projections, how we plan to support and carry out our mission work. Sometimes we see organizations start with step 4 without having done the first 3 steps. The final step of the process is to monitor that budget. We build a budget knowing that plans will not work out the way we think. We want a process that allows us to course correct when needed and revisit our assumptions in a user-friendly way. So let's break down each of these steps, starting with assembling the budget team. The budget team depends on the organization's size and structure. Larger organizations may have more staff members with layers of management, and smaller ones may have team members that wear different hats. Start with the finance lead of the organization. In some places, that is the CFO or director of finance. In others, it may be the executive leader. An organization's finance lead is the champion of the budget team, but can't do it alone. It requires the support and the input of all of the other senior leaders. We need the perspective of the HR function around compensation, benefits, professional development. We need the perspectives of all of our program and department managers to make sure that we're accounting for all of the programmatic goals for the year. The development perspective is also important to understand our revenue structure. One person should not develop a budget in isolation. Organizations should bring in their board treasurer or finance committee to provide early input and act as a sounding board. We want to include them in the budget process so there are no surprises when you bring the budget to the full board for final approval. The composition of the budget team should include diverse perspectives from across the organization. Ask yourself whether your budgeting team is reflective of the makeup of your organization and the people you serve in terms of race, gender, and other historically underrepresented characteristics. Next is creating a budget calendar. Timing in the budget process is critical. If you wait until the last minute to begin, it may be difficult to create an inclusive and effective process. Your fiscal year really determines when to start thinking about next year's budget. Here's an example of an organization with a June 30th fiscal year end, starting the budgeting process 6 months prior in January. You may be thinking that 6 months is a long time frame, but not necessarily. We want to ensure that there is enough time for assembling and engaging the budget team and to allow for iterative conversation. And at the 6-month point, you should have a decent idea of how the current year's goals are going. We suggest you place the budgeting process within the wider financial management calendar for the organization. To help with this, you can find a fiscal management activities calendar right here in the Strong Nonprofits Toolkit. The financial management activities calendar includes a timeline for the budget process as well as other key financial activities like the audit process and financial reporting. Then we get to preparing for the budget process. The budget is our financial plan for the year, and the plan should reflect our organization's overarching strategy. So what are our programmatic goals for the year? How many people will we serve? How many cities will we work in? How are we fulfilling our organization's mission? The budget process is also an opportunity to think about what has shifted in our programmatic model in the last few years. How do changes in our programmatic objectives impact the budget? In addition to programmatic goals, there may be financial goals for the organization. Are we attempting to improve our operating reserves? And if so, by how much? Are we putting aside money for capital investments or facility maintenance? Are we making an investment in an increase in equity within our organization? For example, are we working towards more equitable compensation, bringing staff pay in line with market rates? This is a great place to check in with your treasurer or finance committee to make sure that your budget assumptions are aligned with the strategic direction of the organization. Once we understand the goals that will inform the foundation of the budget, we need to gather data and build the template that helps us create the budget. That includes understanding our projected financial performance for the current year by forecasting the results for the rest of the year. How will we end the year? Are we going to achieve the revenues that we planned for this year? Have we gone over on some of the expenses? Are there some significant savings? Budgeting is a multi-step process connecting this year and the next year. If we're able to forecast how we think we're going to end the current year, it will set the stage for how we transition into the next year. Lastly, ensure that there is a kickoff meeting that brings together all of the stakeholders to walk through the timeline, the assumptions, and any financial goals. Now all the groundwork has been done and you can move to actually building the budget. In the for-profit world, there's a natural instinct to start with revenues. What do we think we can generate, and then what will it cost to do it? For nonprofit budgeting, we recommend that you do the reverse and start by budgeting expenses because the expenses reflect our program plans. At the onset, we want to build our budget based on what we want to achieve and do for the year. If the goal for the year is to achieve certain programmatic activities, we first need to know what those activities will cost. If we start with revenue, our thinking may be limited to what our funders are willing to fund and what we have received in the past. This may or may not align with what we want to do in the future. There are a few ways to go about budgeting for expenses. Organizations use different templates, but what is critical is to have a template that actually brings in various components of the budget. In the world of expenses, there are generally three different types of expenses. You have your direct expenses that are really the easiest to identify. They are specific to the delivery of the services. Second, there are shared expenses that you have to incur no matter what. We need to pay for the rent and we need insurance, and that's across all of the functions of the organization. Third, we also have expenses specific to fundraising or management in general, also known as overhead expenses. We have a nonprofit budget template on Strong Nonprofits, which allows organizations to budget by program and functional areas. The template accommodates up to 7 different programs, management in general, and fundraising costs, and it could be a good place to start in building your budget. Once you've set up your expense budget, then you come to the revenue side. In terms of revenue, you may want to think about this in terms of a risk analysis. One of the biggest risks in budgeting is related to revenue planning. It's often easier to estimate expenses because they are predictable. But on the revenue side, you want to plan for flexibility or scenario planning. What if revenue came in at a higher level than expected? What if it came in lower than expected? Analyze your revenue from the perspective of likelihood of receipt. As nonprofit leaders, it's important to understand what are the levels of revenue, how much is committed, how much is anticipated, and how much is yet to be raised. That's what we mean by risk. How much risk are we willing to take on? We also have a revenue scenario planning tool on Strong Nonprofits for you to do just that. Analyze your revenue based on your best, moderate, and worst case scenarios. So now we've built our budget. Most organizations will work to build a budget plan that results in a surplus whenever possible. But there may be times when an organization budgets for a deficit. For example, an organization may make an investment in added development staff, and it may take time, sometimes several years, for fundraising revenue to increase as a result. If you do have a planned deficit, ensure that the assumptions around it are clear. The day-to-day reality of the budget comes to fruition when we think about the cash flow of that budget. Since the timing of nonprofit revenue is not always aligned with our expenses, every budget should have an accompanying cash flow forecast projected out at least 12 months. We might be planning for a surplus budget, but if our government funder doesn't pay us until after the final report has been submitted, we need to ensure that we have sufficient cash flow to cover those expenses in the meantime. Some of these things are out of our control. There is a cash flow projections tool on Strong Nonprofits as well that can help you get started on this step. Organizations will next need to get board approval for the budget. This may come in 2 steps. If you have a finance committee, they may review it first and ask for an initial round of revisions. And then the budget goes to the full board for their approval, including a narrative detail outlining budget assumptions, risks, and opportunities is an important piece to help highlight and clarify the story behind the numbers for the board. Once the budget is approved by the board, ensure that the final budget is communicated back to the staff. This is a critical step in ensuring the transparent and inclusive budgeting process we outlined at the onset. The final step of the budget process is what comes after the budget is finalized, monitoring the budget. Once the budget is completed, we have to monitor how we do against it. Otherwise, why do we do it? Think about what types of reports different stakeholders should receive and review on a regular basis. On a monthly basis, program leaders and anyone involved in budget development should receive reports to make sure they are on track with the budget they are responsible for. Senior leadership should receive all that, as well as an organization-wide perspective, balance sheet, cash flow, etc. Everything that we thought of during the budget development process, we want to continue to revisit. Similarly, we want to keep the board informed. A management narrative is very helpful here. It's a continuation of that financial story that we discussed with the budget narrative. A dashboard is another item on this list. For some board members, financial reports might be overwhelming. Dashboards help to organize the key performance indicators that require the board's attention. So this is just a snapshot of what reporting might look like. So that's an overview of the 5-step budgeting process. I want to remind everyone of the additional resources that are available on the Strong Nonprofits Toolkit that we've mentioned throughout this webinar, including the Fiscal Management Activities Calendar, the Nonprofit Budget Template, the Revenue Scenario Planning Tool or Analysis Worksheet, the Cash Flow Projections Template. Thanks again for joining us. We hope you're able to explore all of these resources and more here on strongnonprofits.org. Thanks.